The gavel went up at 6 in the morning, and the whole town of Cedar Bend held its breath. Frost still clung to the fence rails. 40 people stood in the street in their winter coats, and not one of them wanted to be there. On the steps of the land office, Sheriff Boone Mercer held the auction papers in his bare hand, and his hand was shaking. It was not the cold. The ranch being sold that morning was the Long Sea. 1,200 acres of good grass along Sage Creek, a sound house, a barn her husband had raised with his own hands. It belonged to Etta Calloway. It had belonged to Calloway's for 19 years. Etta was not there. Her chair by the auction block sat empty. Her neighbors kept glancing down the East Road, and the East Road kept staying empty too. Silas Crane, the banker, stood at the front in his gray coat with a fresh shave and a small, patient smile. He had waited months for this morning. He could wait 5 minutes more. Sheriff Mercer read the notice slowly. He read it the way a man reads something he despises, every word dragged out of him. Default of payment, public sale, all parcels, all water rights, all improvements. When he finished, he looked down the East Road himself, longer than a sheriff should. Nothing. Crane raised one finger. 2,000, he said, pleasant as a church greeting. No one bid against him. No one in Cedar Bend had $2,000, and everyone knew it. The gavel rose, and that was when they heard it. Hoofbeats. 2 horses, coming hard out of the gray morning light, and a woman's voice, carrying over the frost like a rifle shot. Hold that gavel, Boone Mercer, or so help me you will wear it. Etta Calloway came up the main street at a dead gallop, mud to her waist, 3 days of mountain winter on her face. Behind her rode an enormous stranger in wolf hides that half the town took for a ghost. She did not slow until she reached the steps. She swung down, walked through the crowd, and put one hand flat on the auction block. In her other hand was a leather wallet tied with string. What was inside that wallet took 4 minutes to read out loud. When the reading was done, no ranch was sold that morning. One man left the street in handcuffs instead, and it was not the stranger in the wolf hides. I have read a great many frontier auction notices from those years, and I can tell you that not 1 in 1,000 ended the way this one did. To understand what was in that wallet, and what it cost Etta Calloway to bring it down out of the mountains in the dead of winter, we have to go back 3 weeks, back to the morning the trouble started. Stay with her. Every mile of this ride matters, and the ending is worth every step. 3 weeks before the auction, Etta Calloway was breaking ice on the stock tank with the back of an axe. She was 34 years old. She had run the Long Sea alone for 2 years, ever since a horse rolled on her husband Thomas in a spring flood, and the creek gave him back 3 days later. The town had expected her to sell then. She had not sold. She had cut her hay, culled her herd, and ridden her own fence lines through 2 winters. And slowly, Cedar Bend had stopped saying the widow Calloway and started saying that Cowgirl on Sage Creek, which suited her fine. The morning the trouble started, she saw a buggy coming up her lane. Buggies meant town men. Town men in January meant nothing good. Silas Crane stepped down carefully, keeping his boots out of the muck. He had banker's hands and a voice like warm oil, and he stood in her yard and told her, with great sorrow, that the note on the Long Sea had come due. Etta stood very still. Thomas paid that note, she said. Paid it off entire, the autumn before he died. Crane's face folded into sympathy. He was good at sympathy. He explained that the bank's ledger showed no such payment. He explained that $1,100 plus interest was owed against the ranch, and that the bank had carried the debt out of respect for her grief, just as long as it decently could. You have 30 days, Mrs. Calloway, he said gently. The law gives you that much. I wish I could give you more. She watched his buggy roll away, small and black against the white hills, and her hands did not start shaking until it was out of sight. Here is what Etta knew the way you know your own name. In October of that last year, Thomas had sold 90 steers at the railhead in Cheyenne. He had come home lit up like a lamp, kissed her in front of the hired man, and ridden into Cedar Bend the very next morning to clear the note. She remembered the shirt he wore. She remembered him saying that a man sleeps different on paid-for ground. What she did not have was the paper. Thomas's receipt, the one Crane's own clerk had written out, had been in Thomas's coat. The coat had been on Thomas, and the creek had taken them both in the flood, and given back only one. No paper, no proof. The bank's ledger against a dead man's word, and a widow's memory against a banker's books. That night, Etta sat at her kitchen table until the fire burned down. Some women would have wept, and no shame in it. She took out paper and a pencil instead, and she wrote down every single thing she could remember about the day Thomas paid that note. The weather, the shirt, the names, and near the bottom of that list, her pencil stopped moving, because Thomas had not ridden into town alone that morning. There had been a witness in the bank, a man who stood behind him at the counter, close enough to see the money change hands, a man everybody in the territory knew by sight and nobody knew well, Jubal Hart, the mountain man. To see why that name mattered, you need to know what kind of man Silas Crane was and what he had been doing to Sage Creek for 3 quiet years. Crane had come to Cedar Bend from St. Louis with soft hands and a hard plan. Land along Sage Creek was the best in the county, and the railroad surveymen had been through twice that fall, and Crane read railroad men the way other men read weather. A spur line was coming. Whoever held the creek bottoms when it came would name his own price, so Crane had been collecting. A foreclosure here, a quiet, friendly purchase there, from a widow or a war veteran or a family burned out and starved down to the last sack of flour. Always legal, at least on paper, that he himself kept. In 3 years, 5 ranches along the creek had passed through his ledger and into his name. The Long C was the biggest and the best of what remained, and it sat square in the path of the survey stakes. Etta learned some of this from her neighbor, old Mrs. Paget, who missed nothing and forgave less. The 2 women sat in the Paget kitchen 2 days after Crane's visit, and the older woman poured coffee and laid it out plain. He did the Ashbys the same way, Mrs. Paget said, claimed the ledger showed money owing that Amos swore on his Bible he'd paid. Amos had no paper either. They're in Oregon now, or under it. The sheriff, Etta started. The sheriff, Mrs. Paget said the word carefully, like she was setting down a hot pan. Boone Mercer is a fair man, child, fair as they come, but fair men enforce crooked paper every day of the week, because the paper is all the law can see. You bring Boone Mercer proof, and he'll tear Silas Crane down to the boards. Without proof, he'll auction your home with tears in his eyes, and it will still be auctioned. Etta rode home in the blue dusk, and she thought about Boone Mercer, and that thought was its own kind of complicated, because the sheriff of Cedar Bend had been Thomas Calloway's closest friend. He had carried her husband's coffin, and for 2 years now he had found reasons to ride out past the Long C every week or so, checking on a fence cut here, a stray dog there, reasons so thin you could read newsprint through them. He would sit his horse in her yard and drink 1 cup of coffee, never dismounting for 2, and talk about weather and cattle, and then he would touch his hat brim and ride away like a man leaving something behind. She had never once asked him to stay. She was a widow on paid-for ground, or ground she had believed was paid for, and some doors you keep shut because you are not sure your own hand on the latch can be trusted. Now the man who might have courted her, if either of them had been braver, was the man the law would send to sell her home. Boone Mercer came out to the long sea on the 5th day, and this time he got down off his horse. He stood in her kitchen with his hat in his hands, a big, quiet man gone gray early at the temples, and he could not look at her while he said what he had come to say. The bank had filed. The court had stamped it. If nothing changed in 25 days, the law required him to conduct the sale himself, on the steps of the land office, by public notice. "I'd sooner dig a well with a spoon," he said. "I want you to know that." "I know it," Etta said. "If you've got the receipt, Etta. Anything with ink on it." "The creek has it," she said, and watched him flinch, because the creek had Thomas in that sentence too, and they both heard it. Boone turned his hat in a slow circle. Then he said something a sheriff probably should not say. He said that Crane's ledgers had smelled wrong to him for 3 years, that the Ashby business had kept him up nights, and that a ledger is only as honest as the man who holds the pen. But smell is not evidence. His badge worked for the paper, not for his nose. "Find me 1 page, 1 witness, 1 anything," he said, "and I will stand it up in front of Judge Whitfield if I have to carry it there on my back." Etta looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind was moving snow across the yard in low white ropes. "There was a man in the bank the day Thomas paid," she said, standing at the counter. "He saw the whole of it." "Who?" "Jubal Hart." The name landed in the kitchen like a dropped iron. Everyone in the territory had a Jubal Hart story, and no 2 of them matched. He was a relic of the Beaver days, older than the town itself. He came down out of the Wind River country once a year, in October, traded furs and bought salt, coffee, and cartridges, spoke maybe 40 words, and vanished. He had wintered up there alone for 30 years. Men who went looking for his cabin in the cold months had a way of coming back frostbit, or not coming back at all. "Etta," Boone said her name very carefully. "It is January." "I can count, Sheriff. Nobody rides into the winds in January. Trappers don't." "The Army doesn't." "He signed it," Etta said. "That's the part you don't know yet. Thomas told me that night, laughing about it. Crane's clerk needed a witness for a payment that size, and the clerk asked the man standing behind him, and Jubal Hart put his name on the bank's own copy of that receipt. If the ledger has no payment in it, then somewhere there is a receipt Crane never burned, because his clerk wrote 2, and one of them walked out the door in a mountain man's possibles bag. Jubal Hart keeps every paper he ever signs. His kind always do. Paper is rare up there. It was the longest speech anyone in Cedar Bend had heard from her in 2 years. Boone Mercer stood in the middle of it like a man standing in weather. "Then I'll go," he said finally. "You will not. You're the law here, and the law has to be standing on those steps in 25 days, not frozen in a drift halfway up a mountain. Besides," she almost smiled, "you'd never find him. I will." "How?" "Thomas packed into that country every autumn for 15 years. I went with him for 9 of them. I know which creek Hart traps, and I know what his smoke smells like." She was already reaching for the coat hooks. "You keep Crane off my land and off my back, Boone Mercer. I'll be home before the gavel," he argued. It did him no good, and some part of him plainly knew it, because when he ran out of arguments, he went out to the barn without being asked, and started checking her tack like a man who intended her to live. At the door, mounted, she looked down at him. Neither of them said anything you could call tender. He handed up a box of cartridges and said, "Bring back the paper." And then, quieter, in a voice that had nothing to do with paper at all, "Bring back the rider." She was gone before first light. There is a kind of cold in the Wind River country in January that does not feel like weather. It feels like a decision the land has made about you. Etta rode out with 2 horses, a saddle mount and a pack mare, 40 pounds of feed, food for 10 days, and her husband's old buffalo coat that still smelled faintly of his pipe. The first day was easygoing, river flats and wagon track. She made 20 miles and slept in the Hollisters' hay barn, and Mrs. Hollister pressed a jar of honey on her at dawn and did not ask a single question, which is its own kind of kindness. Behind her, in Cedar Bend, Silas Crane heard within a day that the widow had ridden west with a pack mare. He found it amusing. He told the men at the hotel bar that grief takes people strange ways, and he bought a round, and he moved the auction notice to the front window of the bank where the whole street could read it. 24 days, the notice said. He had the date circled on his desk calendar in red ink. He also did one other thing, and it should be remembered, because it tells you everything about the man. He sent a rider to the county seat to ask, quietly, whether a public sale could be moved up if the owner was believed to have abandoned the property. The answer came back no. Crane filed the letter away and smiled and settled in to wait. Patient men are dangerous. Patient women, as he was about to learn, are worse. The second day the track ran out. She followed the frozen river into the foothills, riding on old snow that held a horse one step and swallowed him to the belly the next. She learned to read the crust by its color. Blue-white held, gray lied. By dusk, the temperature was falling like a stone down a well, and she made camp in a cottonwood grove, cut wood until her arms burned, and kept the fire alive in shifts with her own shivering. Somewhere out in the dark, wolves were talking to each other about the horses. She sat up with the rifle across her knees and told them, out loud, that they were welcome to try. Her voice sounded small. She kept talking anyway, because Thomas had always said a fire and a human voice will hold most trouble at the far edge of the light. The third day nearly killed her. The route into Hart's Valley crossed a saddle between two peaks, a bare white shoulder of mountain where the wind had scoured the snow to blue ice. Halfway across, the pack mare went down. She slid 30 feet, screaming, legs milling, and fetched up against a rock spine with the packs half burst and her eyes rolling white. Etta went down after her on foot, step by step, driving the axe head in for a handhold. The wind up there did not gust. It leaned, steady as a hand on her chest, trying with real patience to peel her off the mountain. It took her 1 hour to get the mare up, 1 more to redistribute the packs, and when she finally led both horses down off the far side of the saddle, the light was going, and her hands would not close all the way. That night, in a spruce hollow, she came as near to quitting as she ever came, not near enough to turn around, but near enough to understand, for the first time, that she could actually die up here, and that if she did, Crane would have the long sea by February, and nobody would ever know the ledger lied. She thought about a thing she had once read in a newspaper, years before, about the sharpshooter, Annie Oakley. Oakley had said, "Aim at a high mark and you will hit it." Etta had cut the line out and pinned it inside the pantry door, and Thomas had teased her about taking shooting advice from a woman in a magazine, and she had pointed out that the woman in the magazine could outshoot him sitting down. Aim at a high mark. Well, the mark did not sit much higher than a signed receipt in a hermit's cabin, somewhere in 10,000 square miles of frozen rock. She fed the fire, rubbed the mare's legs with liniment until the trembling stopped, and slept in 20-minute pieces with her back against a spruce trunk. On the fourth morning, the world went silent and very bright, the way high country does after hard wind, and on the still air, thin as a pencil line, faint as memory, she smelled it. Pine smoke, and under it, the bitter green smell of boiling spruce needles. Thomas had taught her that smell. Trapper's tea. Jubal Hart was home. The cabin sat in a pocket of spruce with its back to a cliff, half buried in drift, chimney breathing that thin gray line into the blue morning. Etta stopped her horses 100 yards out, the way Thomas had taught her, and called ahead. "Mr. Hart, my name is Etta Calloway. Thomas Calloway's wife. I've come 3 days through the snow to ask you one question. Silence, long enough that her heart began to argue with her. Then the door opened, and a man filled the whole frame of it. He was old the way granite is old, huge through the shoulders, white-bearded to the chest, wrapped in wolf hides. He looked at her, at the horses, at the mountain behind her, reading the whole of her journey in one long glance. "Calloway," he said. His voice was rusted from disuse. "The one the creek took." "Yes, sir. Good man. Traded me a Sharp's rifle once. Didn't cheat." He stepped aside. "Woman that rides the saddle in January gets a fire." "Ask your question inside." The inside of Jubal Hart's cabin was small, dark and orderly as a ship. Furs on stretchers, tools on pegs, and nailed to the log wall above his bunk, a flat tin box, the kind sea captains kept papers in. She asked her question, with her hands still shaking from the cold. Did he remember an October morning, 4 years back, in the cattleman's bank in Cedar Bend? A big laughing man paying off a note in cash. A clerk who asked the stranger at the counter to witness the receipt. Jubal Hart did not answer right away. He poured her a cup of spruce tea, sat down across the fire, and studied her. "Bankers trying to take your ground," he said. It was not a question. "Same banker whose clerk wrote that paper?" "The same. Knew a man like that at Fort Bridger in '51. Weighed his own scales." He got up, took down the tin box, and opened it with a small key he wore around his neck on a wang of leather. Inside were maybe 30 papers, browned and soft with age, a discharge from someplace, letters, and near the top, folded in quarters, a bank receipt with 3 signatures on it. "Keep every paper I sign," Jubal Hart said. "Paper's rare up here. Names are rarer." Etta read it by firelight. Received of Thomas Calloway, $1,140, in full satisfaction of note against the Long Sea Ranch. The clerk's signature. Thomas's signature. That beloved backhand scrawl she had not seen in 2 years. And beneath them both, in letters carved slow and square like initials in a tree, Jubal Hart, his hand. She read it twice more. Her thumb moved over Thomas's signature the way you would touch a sleeping child, careful, so as not to wake anything. She did not cry in front of him. She came close. "There's more you should know," she said when she could talk. "A paper can be called a forgery. Crane will stand in the street and swear this never happened, and it's his clerk's word against ink." The old man was quiet for a moment. Then he did something that no one in Cedar Bend would have believed. He began packing a war bag. "Then I'll come down and say it to his face," he said. 30 years I've let the valleys rot without me. One more won't kill me." He glanced at her, and something underneath the granite almost smiled. "Besides, I want to see the man's expression." They came down out of the winds ahead of a storm, and the storm chased them the whole way home. 5 days, this time, because the weather stole 2. There was an afternoon on the river flats when the snow came sideways and the world shrank to 10 feet of screaming white, and the 2 of them roped the horses nose to tail and walked, compass blind, while Hart read the wind like scripture and called the turns. There was a night in a line shack with 1 blanket between 4 living things. Etta learned more about that silent old man in 5 days than the territory had learned in 30 years. He had buried 2 partners and a Shoshone wife. He said her name once into the fire and did not say it again. On the last night, with the lights of Cedar Bend finally shivering in the valley below, he asked her a question. "That sheriff, the one you keep not talking about, he straight? Straight as a plumb line. Then why ain't he married you?" Hart asked, with the terrible directness of a man 30 years out of practice at conversation. "Man rides past a good ranch and a good woman, once a week for 2 years. That ain't law work. That's courting without the nerve. Etta was very glad it was dark. "The auction is at 6 tomorrow," she said. "We should sleep." "Uh-huh," said Jubal Hart to the fire. They overslept exactly nothing, but a lamed pack mare on the frozen creek crossing cost them the last dark hour, and that is why, at 6 o'clock, as the gavel rose over her empty chair, Etta Calloway was still a mile east of town, riding like the whole winter was behind her, because it was. You already know what the town heard next. Hoofbeats and a voice like a rifle shot. She put the receipt in Boone Mercer's hands herself, on the land office steps, in front of 40 witnesses. The sheriff read it once in silence. Then he read it out loud, every word, and the street was so quiet you could hear the paper tremble. Received in full satisfaction. The clerk's name. Thomas's name. Jubal Hart, his hand. Crane laughed. Give the man this much, he was cool as the frost. A forgery, he announced. And a sad one. A desperate widow and some mountain drifter, cooking up ink in a cabin. His ledger was the record of account, and his ledger showed the debt plain, and his clerk would swear to it. 2 things went wrong for Silas Crane in the next minute. The first was that his clerk, a thin young man named Pettibone, who had been sweating in the crowd since dawn, looked at the receipt, then at Jubal Hart, standing beside the horses like a judgment out of the Old Testament, and broke. Right there in the street. He had written 2 copies, he said, voice cracking. He had entered the payment in the daybook, and Mr. Crane had taken the daybook home that Christmas. And in January there had been a new daybook, recopied, he was told, because of water damage. He had kept his mouth shut because he had a mother to feed. He was sorry. He said it to Etta, not to the crowd. He was sorry. The second thing was Boone Mercer's face. Men who were there said afterward they had never seen a man so happy to make an arrest. He took the ledger into evidence, and Silas Crane into custody in the same 5 minutes. And when Crane started shouting about lawyers, the sheriff agreed pleasantly that lawyers would be needed, seeing as forging bank records to steal deeded land was the kind of thing territorial judges liked to discuss at length. Judge Whitfield discussed it at length that spring. The recopied ledger, the surviving receipt, and Pettibone's testimony unwound not only the Long Sea business, but the Ashby foreclosure behind it. Crane left Cedar Bend in a prison wagon. The bank's new owners, anxious to be loved, forgave what remained of the Ashby family's losses and mailed a bank draft to an address in Oregon. And the railroad spur came through 2 years later, exactly where Crane had bet it would. It crossed Sage Creek on Calloway land. The right-of-way payment alone was more than his crooked ledger had ever dreamed of stealing. Jubal Hart stayed a week, which the town talked about for a decade. He slept in the barn by choice, mended every hinge on the place out of what he called habit, and rode back into the winds before the thaw, carrying a year of coffee and a standing invitation. Every October after, for as long as he lived, 2 horses came down out of the mountains instead of 1, and there was always a plate set for him at the Long Sea. As for the sheriff, on an evening in April, with the creek running loud and the cottonwoods just budding out, Boone Mercer rode up her lane, and this time he got down off his horse, without a fence cut or a stray dog to blame it on. Etta met him on the porch. Folks say she poured 2 cups of coffee before he said a word, and that the second cup had been sitting ready on the tray, and that he saw it, and understood it, and had to hold on to the porch rail for a second. They were married in June, in the yard, under the cottonwoods. Mrs. Paget cried. Pettibone, forgiven and promoted, kept the bank's books honest for 40 years, and named his first daughter Etta. The brand over the gate never changed. Mercer never asked it to. The Long Sea had been bought once with cattle money, and once more with 3 days of mountain winter, and everyone in that valley knew exactly whose ranch it was. It belonged to the Cowgirl on Sage Creek. It always had. If this story warmed you, there is another one waiting, and I would be glad of your company for it. The frontier kept no shortage of women like Etta. Their stories are told, one complete tale at a time, right here on the Cowgirl Chronicles.